Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on women, girls, and artificial intelligence, paving the way to a balanced digital future. My name is Marta Encinas Martin, and I am the gender lead at the Education and Skills Directorate at the OECD. This webinar will last around 1 hour, and we will have a short presentation at the very beginning to set the scene, and it will be followed by a panel discussion, which I will introduce a bit later. So this webinar will focus on how AI is shaping the futures, and it is transforming both the labor market and the education system. And as it does so, we need to make sure it narrows rather than widens the gender gap, right? So we have received in the when you were registered many questions from you already from the audience. There is a very large audience, and we encourage you to continue asking us questions, comments, putting up your work if you wish. We will do also that. And I will try to read the questions to our panelists if we have time. And if I can manage to get, so usually it's very overwhelming with questions, but that's good. And we will try to get to them. So now, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce to you Celine Kaira, who is an economist and policy analyst at the Artificial Intelligence Unit of the OECD Directorates of Science, Technology, and Innovation. She will be setting the scene and highlighting OECD work in this area. Celine, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marta, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. As mentioned, my name is Celine Kaira. I'm on the AI team at the OECD, and I will be setting a bit of the scene today with offering some data, a little bit around policy, but also leaving you with tools and insights from the OECD.ai Policy Observatory, which I hope can be a resource to you all. So jumping right in, just to mention that at the OECD, what really grounds our work is the OECD AI principles. This is a recommendation to governments from 2019, renewed in 2020, reviewed in 2024, and it really sets the foundation for with 5 values-based principles and 5 recommendations to governments. And here you see really elements that are relevant and cross-cutting when we talk about the topic at hand. Elements like respecting human rights, fairness, robustness, and they relate strongly to issues of bias when we talk about AI and women. We also see on the recommendations to government side from a policy perspective, considerations pertaining to women from ensuring their representation in AI research and development to building human capacity and and women's participation in the AI workforce. So a little bit on our work on specifically on this topic. So back in 2022, we published actually quite an extensive report in partnership with UNESCO and the Inter-American Development Bank that traces the AI considerations along the work life cycle of women. So for example, from schooling, training, recruitment, retention, and really to end of career. So I won't go into detail here, but mention this as a resource. And unsurprisingly, the report found that there are still knowledge gaps when it comes to studying the effects of AI on the working lives of women, and it calls for further study and collaboration on this issue. So I'm very happy to be having this webinar and this panel discussion today that helps and contributes to exactly this by way of a rich discussion. So, we have not just stopped with that report in 2022. We've continued work, analytical work on this topic. And I should mention that we have something called the AI Wonk, which is a policy blog available on OECD.ai. And it's really excellent daily reading for keeping up with everything going on in AI. And there are specific articles and blog posts from reputable contributors related to this topic. And here I just highlight one blog post on an event where we convened with the African Union looking into women's economic empowerment in AI on the continent. And we also have a post covering LinkedIn jobs data. Now, I mention that because we have Rosie here participating. She's from LinkedIn, participating in the panel discussion. And we've had a really fruitful collaboration on this data. And I will show you a little bit about it today. So let's get let's get now to the data. I'll walk you through some sample data we have on OECD.ai, focusing on AI research, and also AI skills with data from LinkedIn. And I should mention, as I mentioned, this really fruitful collaboration with LinkedIn we've had for several years now, and I'm pleased to note that we will be launching some updated data, the updated 2024 data in April 2025. Well, this April, very soon, in the coming month. So, without further ado, let's now get to some of the data points. So here you see the number of AI publications by gender globally from 2010 to 2023, as measured by the number of AI publications with at least one male or female author, respectively. And again, perhaps unsurprisingly, we see here that AI research, so the dark blue line above, is still dominated by men. But while the number of publications co-authored by at least one woman is increasing, so we have a good upward slope, the gap still widens as the number of publications increase. So this is somewhat of a positive trend, but the number of publications with at least one female co-author is increasing over time. But more needs to be done to now narrow this gap. And why is this important? Why is this gap significant? Well, because gender disparities in research can lead to a lack of diversity in perspectives that shape the AI development and deployment later down the AI value chain. And so lack of representation has very real impacts later down the AI value chain, and has downstream effects on everything from algorithmic bias to inclusive innovation. So moving from research, let's now look at the job market. So data on AI jobs and skills. So here we see LinkedIn data providing, again, valuable insights into gender representation among AI talent. So as of 2023, 0.4% of male and 0.2% of female LinkedIn members reported AI skills. So this shows that AI talent is still a small subset of the broader workforce, and that women are significantly underrepresented here. So while women make up, again, this small share, the year-over-year growth rate in AI talent for women is actually higher than for men. So perhaps this is a positive finding. It suggests that women are entering the field, more women, and though from a lower baseline than their male counterparts. So continuing to look from different perspectives here, the previous slide showed the growth rate. This chart highlights the overall gender composition of AI talent and how that has evolved over time from 2016 to 2023. The methodology here, it looks at AI-related skills such as machine learning, deep learning, NLP, natural language processing, by gender worldwide. And so in 2016, women made up around 25% of the global AI talent pool. And, fast forward to today, to, 2023, we'll have the updated data soon. This number has modestly risen to 27%. And so, this slow growth really underlines the need for sustained efforts from education to hiring practices to really bring more women into AI roles and close this gender gap in high-tech fields. I have a few more slides for you here looking at, again, this is disaggregated by country. So we see that Singapore leads with the highest share of female AI talent at 35%, followed by Romania and Finland. But only 10 out of 44 countries have more than 30% female representation in AI talent. So again, when we look disaggregated by country, we still see this gap persist. And last slide here on the data. Here we have disaggregated data by sector. Education, perhaps unsurprisingly, has the highest share of AI female talent at 29%. And this, again, may reflect the broader gender composition of women engagement in the education workforce. But, and we see similar levels across other sectors such as ICT, manufacturing, professional, and financial services. And so just two more slides to conclude. You've seen a snapshot here, what the data says in terms of the state of play, and it's really, showing us that more work needs to be done. on a policy level to narrow the gaps that the data shows. Thankfully, countries are aware and have been focusing on this issue. I will mention OECD.ai as a resource for you. So we have what I would say is the largest government-backed and up-to-date policy repository of AI policy in the world. And it includes over 1,000 AI policies from over 70 countries. And so here we track nearly 50 AI-related policies that include gender dimensions. So you can click on each of the countries to see related national policies and the subset that relates to gender. The last tool I want to leave you with today is, policies and data are one part, but we're also tracking the incidents, the AI incidents. And so this is where things go wrong with the use of AI. This is especially relevant for generative AI because laws like the EU AI Act will require reporting on AI incidents, for example. This tool is live at oecd.ai/incidents. So please have a look. It is a live search tool. Here you see I've typed in gender, and you can find related news articles from reputable media sources around the world that illustrate AI incidents related to gender. So that concludes my presentation today. I've tried to set the scene and just to summarize that, although there's been modest progress over the years, more can and should be done along the AI value chain from AI research to deployment and use, really to ensure that women are empowered when it comes to harnessing the full potential of AI. So I really look forward to the panel discussion today to learn more about these issues in practice. Thank you very much, and back over to you, Marta.
Thank you very much, Celine, for this very clear and very insightful presentation for our discussion. It's clear with the data you show that women talent is definitely underrepresented. I was very surprised that even in education is underrepresented, which is each subject, which we know that mostly women study and they are overrepresented, but not in AI. So this is gonna bring us to our discussion and the need to start these discussions early so we can see that there is no more gender gaps and we don't reproduce stereotypes through AI. So I'm very pleased to introduce this panel with Rosie Hood, who is lead data scientist in LinkedIn Economic Graph Research Institute, Anna Jan, Senior Director of Policy and Inclusion at Mila, and my colleague Stefan Vincent Lancran, who is Senior Analyst and Deputy Head of Division at the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills. Welcome, the three of you, and Celine will also stay with us. So you can, as I mentioned before, put questions in the chat, and I'll try to read them to them. But I'm going to start with a question for Rosie that comes actually from Pacific Mugisha from Rwanda, who sent it to us ahead of the panel. And Rosie, we know that you do collect lots of very rich data in LinkedIn, as you have also contributed to the blog on OECD report on the effects of AI on the working lives of women. That actually Celine mentioned this report with our colleagues Lucia Russo and Benedict Ruspal, and also Celine. And this question that Mugisha addressed to you is, are you seeing AI specifically impacting women's employment opportunities across different sectors and countries? If that is the case, could you let us know a little about what is being done about it? Thank you.
Sure. So the short answer is yes. We do see that. We do see the potential of AI impacting women's employment opportunities. So I say that it's kind of twofold. So historically, women tend to be overrepresented in certain types of jobs, and many of those jobs stand to change due to generative AI. So we see in most countries that women are more likely than men to be in occupations that we would define as disrupted by Gen AI. So that's occupations that require skills that are evolving to leverage Gen AI tools. And in turn, women tend to not be in occupations that are augmented or insulated, which are occupations that require skills that rely more on human proficiency. And also we kind of looked at this globally. So we analyzed, maybe something like 80 countries, and in 95% of those countries, we saw that the share of men working in augmented occupations, so ones that can leverage Gen AI more than being disrupted by it, is always higher than women. So that's kind of worrying. So I can give an example like of occupations that would be. So maybe medical clerk or a clinical research assistant or a sales operation assistant all have high shares of being disruptive for women. But I suppose, more importantly, women aren't just in occupations that are kind of more affected by Gen AI. They're also less likely to be skilled in Gen AI. So we're seeing, women don't tend to add Gen AI skills compared to men on platform, which is another issue. And why that barrier exists, we can kind of have some guesses around, but that's something that we need to work on. So there's this kind of occupational segregation component that we need to address, and then there's the upskilling component we need to address. But the good news is that it's early on. I think ChatGPT came out in 2022, so there's still time to make these changes, and we can kind of address these gender gaps that are forming.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, it is time to address those changes, and it's good that we are starting the discussion. And we are going to now move to Stefan. You lead the OECD Digital Education Outlook, and this publication addresses these issues. And we will actually put the link in the chat for those who want to read it, and I recommend the reading of this recurrent publication. So I was very curious to read that the Outlook highlights the importance of taking into account algorithmic bias in AI applications. Could you please, Stefan, explain to the audience what specifically this is and how does it manifest in terms of gender disparities?
Thank you, Martha, for having me and inviting everyone to read the book. We have actually a chapter on that. Well, the algorithmic bias is quite important, and the first aspect of it is when it's representational. And in some cases, for example, we can see that when a generative AI generates images of medical students or doctors, then it will actually generate 60% of male medical students, and only 40% of female, when actually we know that it's not quite the reality. So that's really one aspect. And so those are the ones that are relatively easy to see. Another kind of bias, which is studied, is actually related to the performance of the AI tools and whether they perform the same way for male and female and don't disadvantage one of them. So, for example, for that, you could imagine that, for dropout, for example, that we have a few studies showing that you have more false positives for women, which means that you can actually intervene sometimes less accurately, or that, in terms of in study in Chile, showing that in terms of college success, you actually underestimate in that particular case, so you overestimate the success of the girls, and so that actually you perhaps are not going to recommend the things the way that you would do. One interesting aspect of it, so obviously one of the reasons why this is coming is sometimes because the patterns are gendered, the reasons why you are going to stay engaged in your studies or that you're going to be interested, etc., can actually vary, in terms of the general patterns, not just individual ones. But sometimes it's also related to technical issues, So, for example, you have an intersectionality dimension. Sometimes, you have some of these biases that appear when you also add additional information. So there was, for example, one study which were comparing predicting the college success of male and female students in presence or online, and that actually ended up being unfair, and actually overrepresenting, so favoring online males, but only in one case if you added that socio-demographic information, so if that wasn't taken into account. So all of these questions is really about fine-tuning. And people really have to pay attention to verify to what extent, these things are really happening. So it's a question of data. It's a question of the models that are being used. And for that, what is a very important dimension, and I would say that mainly, for our European audience, is also that you need to collect data even the one that sometimes you find sensitive. So I would say that, we are very used to collecting gender data. But for some of the other ones, if you want to identify algorithmic bias, then you need to have some level of collection of this information.
Thanks very much, Stefan. There is someone in the audience, Michael Walker, that said it's so relevant that you are focusing on bias, but also the dropout issue. They are not taking place only in medical studies, but also in many fields. True. And I also wonder if you put a teacher, probably you get a male, and even though most teachers are actually women, but the bias goes there. I like when you put the overestimation of the success of the girls. That's true. I mean, sometimes we don't worry about girls in education because we think they are very, very good, and then we don't worry about their dropouts or obviously the career choice, which is one of the very sensitive topics that we have addressed in other webinars. But now I'm going to go to Anna Jan, that following Stefan's reactions and based on the GPAI report, now you will explain a bit about it, towards substantive equality, in AI highlights systemic barriers to gender equality, right, in artificial intelligence. From your perspective, what are the most pressing challenges that need to be addressed? Anna?
Thank you, Marta. Maybe I can actually just follow up a bit on Rosie's and Stefan's comments, just because we're already in the NU education, and I come back to the report in a second. But maybe I'm just going to actually talk a bit about a bit on the maybe solution space. So we have a bit of an appreciation of the issue and the challenge that we have. And one of the programs that we are running at Mila is called the AI for Good Lab. And it was founded by Professor Doina Prekap and Angelique Manella almost now 10 years ago. So they were real trailblazers in the kind of thinking about why do we have that gender gap in the field of AI and machine learning at the time. And especially Doina Prekap, coming from Romania, she was really struck by, in Romania, you had almost gender balance in all STEM studies. And she was struck when she came to Canada that this wasn't the case at all. And specifically, a real massive gap at the time, I think around almost only 5% of women in the field of machine learning. And so she really felt that there needs to be something that we need to do. So the AI for Good Lab is kind of one of the many initiatives that exist around the world to kind of address this. It is a 7-week upskilling program that is basically divided into 2 parts. It's a 4-week kind of really boot camp in machine learning for women and gender diverse people. And then there is a 3-week, almost more like a project like a project week where the trainees are working on an actual AI solution, ideally with kind of a social impact part. And I think it's really interesting to see a bit what we can learn from these kind of programs and what kind of the lessons, especially we have some really good data now on the more long-term outcomes. And what the women are basically in the program are saying, what are the reasons that they were hesitant in the first place to go into machine learning on these kind of fields, and what kind of really made them change their mind after. And so first of all, maybe to share that our data shows that about almost 50% of all our graduates, basically, or that went through the program, pursued a career in AI after. And that's a really high number, given that many of them hadn't even on the radar. So by the way, I should say it's not women and gender diverse in general. They all, normally the intervention happens around third or fourth year of undergrad program. Sometimes we have some master students as well. They are all coming from either the field of mathematics, computer science, sometimes also a couple of related other fields, but this is really the majority. And so they are, but often they would not have picked then a career specifically in AI after. And so after this program, many do so, whether that's in industry or whether that's in the field of research. The biggest finding that I always really like to share, though, is when we look at all the metrics and kind of the things that they got out of the program, it's actually not the technical skills that they got out of it. What they're all saying is the real outcome is that they feel all of a sudden confident that they can actually have a career in machine learning and AI. And so their real increase in confidence is really what is making a real difference here. The other outcome that is interesting is that they're all saying, almost as a second kind of most important outcome, they all of a sudden had an ecosystem and a community that was very different and that felt very different for them as women in this field. So they were in an ecosystem that didn't feel where they're the only woman, or even if it's not often the only, but they didn't feel like the minority. They felt it was a different kind of really just learning environment, and that made a big difference. And on top of that, of course, they had a sense of community and network that all of a sudden that didn't maybe exist before. And then maybe lastly, there is, I think partly because there is such a real sense of impact because of around the project part, I think that also really made a difference for them, because they feel that they're working towards something that, yeah, I think it's not just advancing the technology or advancing the research in this area, but they felt a different kind of sense of purpose. And so this is just, I mean, this is somewhat anecdotal. Every year we have a cohort about 90 trainees in Canada, and so we're delivering this across Canada. But I know of lots of similar initiatives. But it is, I think that the learnings I think are interesting. This is what women and gender diverse people are craving in this space. It's community, it's a boost of confidence, and of course the technical skills as well. But these are some of the findings we had around the AI for Good Lab.
Thanks very much. That's congratulations, very successful program. And this links to a question from that I just read about. Joanna is asking, what is the role of universities here to issue this problem? How can we expand, and what will be the role? We know from PISA, the data we collect at the OECD, that 15 years old don't want to work in the field of technology, which is one of the skills we need to work on AI. So what could be the role of universities to bring them in, Anna? Just I'll stay with you.
Oh, sorry. So I think universities, I mean, can do, of course, a couple of things. First of all, they could, of course, they can think a bit about, and this is not just, of course, in the field of computer science, but in general, think a bit about how do we upskill actually all of our students. So there are a couple of interesting university pilot programs that are now requiring actually AI skills across all programs, so that you have basically mandatory AI course for across the board in all programs, so not just in STEM, but actually everything. And so that's an interesting it's an interesting way of thinking about it, because basically it makes the assumption that we're all that everyone needs to upskill on AI in general. So it's a general, of course, upskilling, but I think that also benefits and exposes, I think, women to the field, and I think maybe sparks a bit interest and just lowers, I think, the barrier of entry a bit. So that's one way. I think I think there are lots of studies, and I think my colleagues here on the webinar probably know more about programs in general and the kind of things that universities can do in general to attract more women into STEM fields. But I think going back a bit to the findings from our program, I think thinking a bit about more the kind of environment and the community that is built, and the kind of actually culture, frankly, that exists in some of these programs. I think that's clearly seems to be there's something there that needs to be addressed. And I think I would want to be a bit careful to exactly prescribe what that actually means. How do you create a culture that is inclusive? How do you create in some case it actually does mean to create specific spaces for women to have a different kind of learning environment. So maybe these are kind of two ideas in terms of what educators, but specifically universities, could do about this. And by the way, we see the real issue specifically in the when it comes to grad students and then actually PhDs. So I think also thinking a bit about what is the intervention and when do we want to think about the intervention. So we see in terms of computer science, across Canada, around 35% or so women. And then once we go into grad studies, we see a bit of a drop off already, depending a bit on the university, but we see a bit of a drop off. But we see a real drop off when we are going into PhD programs. And so again, maybe there is a thinking, like a bit more thinking of where can we intervene and how can we intervene at that point, and what are the issues, and how does it make basically why is this not attractive also for women to make that choice to go into especially the field of machine learning.
And thanks very much, Anna. I'm going to stay in the field of education with Rosie, but looking at the educators, since AI is here to stay, how can we reskill our educators to become AI experts? No, for example, how teachers can adapt and correct homework using AI. And do you think that we see much resistance to do so, Rosie?
Thanks. I just thought that was such a great discussion. So I kind of got wrapped in that. Just to add some points, I'd love to, if you don't mind. We did look at STEM degrees and STEM participation in the workforce. And we find that there's pretty much parity, in a lot of countries around STEM degrees, but the dropout after you leave your STEM degree to go into the workforce is gigantic for women. So I think, crucially, maybe I think, universities do have a role to play there. And also another side of it is that universities need to adapt to Gen AI because students are using it. So, there needs to be kind of, people are more so adopting it, and that's what we see on the platform. So to take it back to your question, we do see a rise of people adding Gen AI skills, or AI, we call it AI literacy. I think that the percentage of jobs as well requiring an AI literacy skill has gone up. So 1 in every 500 jobs is now requiring it. That's still quite small, but we can still see a trend. I think in the last year it went up by something like 6 times. So we're seeing adoption, although I would say that the literacy skills that people are adding tend to be by members that would add AI engineering skills. So there's not a really pure signal coming out of literacy. So like non-STEM or non-AI professionals. But it's still there, and we're still kind of analyzing that. And then, how do you reskill was a great question. But as I was saying with the university component, I think that these career paths that we have are going to need to be much more personalized. And I think we're going to see that become more regular. And I also see, the importance of training. And I think that we've discussed it previously and we're going to discuss it again. But, it can be formal training that you receive at university or, through courses. And it can also be informal, like LinkedIn Learning has a bunch of Gen AI and AI courses that you can do. And I think that together that's going to kind of bridge a gap of like the ability to reskill faster. So I think that Gen AI is a real tool in that sense as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, there is a comment from Karen Page, a positive one, that says that her organization, which is university-based, offers Gen AI training for K-12 teachers, and the attendees are predominantly women. So that's good, which mirrors the gender balance in the profession as well, obviously. Subject representation is nearest spans the range from humanities to math and science and beyond. So thank you so much, Karen, for this comment. And that links to the question I actually want to ask to Stefan, whose next OECD Digital Education Outlook will be on generative AI. Stefan, so what do we know about the use of generative AI by men and women? Are they different patterns, you think?
Well, yes, but let me, before I answer that, continue on the previous discussion. I think that first, on the curriculum, one thing to note is that a lot of countries, not just at the higher education level, but at the school level, are working on introducing some kind of initiation to AI for everyone, and just the basic in 2 different ways. The basic of understanding how AI works, both for teachers and for students, and also in some cases adding it as part of their kind of a technology, computer science thing, so that people. So we may hope that in some time, people will come to higher ed with a little bit more training, initiation about it. Second point I wanted to make is that we're focusing a lot about women entering the STEM field, and I think that with generative AI, so I'm just speculating here, but if you think that, for example, to give you before I go to my point, for example, there was an interesting study in Korea showing that for arts, which is usually less favored by men than women, actually the introduction of generative AI made it much more attractive and, managed to engage and reduce actually the participation and learning for boys and girls. Girls were still doing better. But what I'm saying is that given that, Gen AI is also a communication tool, and we know that the uses of technology have been quite different for men and women, I'm wondering if actually this is not something that will bring back, the worth of humanities in terms of also perhaps communicating with a machine, and in terms of all the prompting and all. And so in a few countries and higher education institutions, there is a new reflection about that, is how do we actually mobilize some other fields like the humanities and see how, the competencies that have been developed in these different types of studies can actually bring, used in a world where Gen AI is becoming more important and we need people who can prompt, code, etc. So it doesn't mean that they're going to produce the next algorithm necessarily, even so, as we know, some of these algorithms are also created by Gen AI. But I think that, perhaps it will also make us reevaluate a little bit what kind of skill sets, are important in the future. So that was just wanted to continue. So I don't know. No, in terms of what we know for the use of Gen AI, actually, we know that women use it much less than men. So, according to a recent World Bank study, there was about ChatGPT is used by 1/3 of women, so that you can see. And if you compare with the internet, it's about 40% of women using it, so that you have this kind of. But interestingly, for some specific niches like image generation, then you have actually a majority of women using these types of tools, compared to the other ones. For teachers, and so because that's really we know that, so it depends, I think, because it's moving very fast. There was a study in 2023 about, the use of Gen AI by teachers in the UK, and which showed that, you had about 30% of males using it against 10% of women, so that you could see there was a huge difference. But a more recent study in the US showed that there is not quite parity, but almost the same. So what we've seen everywhere is that the use has grown really very fast. And so the latest one were more 78% for men teachers against 71% for females. So, there is still a kind of edge, but it's not huge. And it's exactly the same for students. We can see that, for higher education students, there isn't much, a little bit more use by men than women, but not a significant one. You have more of a gap when you go to secondary education, where you have much more use by boys than girls at that level. But the perceptions are pretty equal for men and women. So there is not a negative attitude from women on that. And so that's, yeah. So I would say it's not so bad, it could be much worse than that.
That sounds good and positive. I'm gonna let the rest of the panel react as well, because I see that you all want to speak. But before, I want to read a comment from Martin Henry that says, teachers tell us that there is not enough high quality relevant PLD on artificial intelligence and EdTech in general. We can leave this up to chance, right? So that's one comment that is interesting. People are reacting a lot to your comment on the arts and humanities, that AI is not against it, but they can actually bring it back. So that was a very good and interesting comment as well. And I have a general question on the stereotypes. If AI can bring or can reproduce stereotypes, right? That we already have for women. I don't know if anyone wants to react to this or any comments in the panel. I see Anna nodding, so please go ahead.
So many things to react to, but maybe I'll
Yeah.
just actually start by your question specifically. So actually, that was one of the big findings in our report that we did, which is titled "Towards Substantive Equality in AI." And in this report, we really worked with more than 50 delivery partners across the world to really kind of gather a lot of intel on what are actually the issues around equality around AI, and that is not only, again, for access or education and capacity building, but in general. And indeed, so there was exactly that came up a lot. So access is one issue, but access is not the same as inclusion or meaningful inclusion. So you can have access, or you can have also lack of access, of course, to AI tools or AI capacity building and skills. But more importantly, the systems already that are used and that we're using include already a huge amount of bias, but more importantly, also they just represent really a very small fraction of the population in the world. At the time, at least more than 90% of the actual data that models and especially generative AI models were trained on are coming mostly from North America. And are therefore really not representing really the vast majority of the world population. And that we see that, right? If we Google, if we use ChatGPT and ask, show me a picture of a beautiful woman, it is very often, it shows women that are mostly or at least somewhat more white looking, et cetera, et cetera. So, right, like, so this is, this also, just kind of addresses a bit the challenge of not only do a lot of women in the world don't have access to AI tools and skills, but they also they actually don't see themselves represented in the actual technology itself. And even more so, if you look a bit at the actual, how the technology, how not only the models are trained, but also how, if we look at the AI life cycle and the production of AI systems, there too we can see that there is a real underrepresentation throughout that life cycle, not only by women, but lots of other underrepresented groups. So that is absolutely something that we need to figure out as well. So we can't just kind of talk about representation and access. We need to think a bit about how are these tools actually built, and what kind of data are they built on, and what kind of biases are we reproducing in them. The only other thing I wanted to just maybe add, just because I do think it's a fascinating conversation to think about, how do we bring AI skills, especially in kind of more, kindergarten to high school level, and what's the role of teachers, and how do we think about upskilling teachers in this? Because I do think they play, of course, a crucial role. We are working at MILA, we are all the time contacted by school boards who are thinking about that, and not only, of course, thinking about how can we bring it into our curriculum, but also how do we govern this, and how do we manage actually the use of generative AI in particular in a school setting. And I really have to say that it's such a tricky question, because everyone agrees that this is something that teachers should know about. They should get upskilled themselves, and then of course that they should somehow teach this to children at this stage. And when I say teach, I'm not necessarily meaning how to code, but I actually mean what also, as from a user perspective, how do I access, what are some of the issues also at the risk that are associated with this. And I think the biggest challenge is just, I think everywhere in the world, curricula are really hard to change quickly, and big education systems are big ships that are really hard to kind of turn around and bring new content in. And we've seen a bit, 10 years ago, everyone said everyone needs to learn to code, and we had initiatives that brought coding practices in, and now people are saying no one needs to code anymore because ChatGPT does that really well, and now we need to have this new. So I think there's also a bit of just skepticism, of course, by the education sector to say, wait a minute, we don't even know what we need here and how do we need it. And then how do we, I think, and then on top of it, of course, the challenge that we all have with AI, that the technology is changing so quickly. So the curriculum that is built now is going to be outdated in 6 months. And so that is even harder challenge for really for educators to think about. So isn't really a silver bullet. I do think there is ultimately the best thing that we have is really connecting schools, school boards, educators on a more regular basis with organizations that are up to date and bring this kind of knowledge in. I don't think we can expect all teachers to all of a sudden be AI experts or teach these kind of skills, but really kind of more partner with be that universities, but also lots of nonprofit organizations that are working in this space who can bring this in as kind of a special education program. We see this in other areas as well. Anyway, so this is just two ideas, but really fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much, Anna. That's true that this is changing so fast that changing curriculums and skills is becoming a big challenge. And I see Celine nodding. So maybe you want to react a little bit to what it's been said, Celine?
Sure. Thank you, Marta. This is such a rich discussion, and I really agree with what's been said. And I think maybe if I might also bring in a slightly different and tangential dimension to the conversation. Yes, upskilling is important. Programs specifically meeting the needs of women in AI and the culture shifts that come with that are important. But on a more personal note, I am freshly back from maternity leave, and I have a 9-month-old daughter, if you can tell from the bags under my eyes. This is something that almost we never hear or never comes up in discussions related to AI and women. And so really, also the focus on policy supporting women in maternity leave and reintroduction into the workforce. Of course, this is a broader issue than just AI or the technology sector, but really as we try to unpack why women tend to participate less in the workforce, for example, as someone said, following they complete the STEM degrees, but then they actually, there seems to be this drop off in terms of workforce participation. I'm willing to hypothesize that potentially having children plays some part in that. Many countries, well, some countries, Canada actually have quite generous paid maternity leaves, and they, Canada in particular views paid maternity leave as an economic policy. And so perhaps it's also important to look holistically at addressing paid maternity leave and related policies when it comes to gender equality in AI.
Thank you.
I just need to jump in because I just want to highlight at one point the Vector Institute in Canada had actually offered a AI upskilling program, an introduction to machine learning for women on maternity leave in particular, because it's a time where, of course, I'm not saying you have a lot of time, but often you actually feel a bit disconnected also from the workplace, and having a very flexible fully online program specifically designed for women, I think actually more generally parents on maternity leave, I thought was a really, really interesting idea to kind of think about, especially that group.
Thank you both. That's actually we have a survey at the OECD called PIAC, is the survey about the skills, and we ask it's from 16 to 65 years old, and we ask them if they participate in training, which training, well, lots of questions about training, and women are unable to participate in training because of family obligations, and not so much men actually. So yes, you are right, Celine. This reskilling is probably more difficult for women in that sense. And also when I look at regulations, and maybe Rosie can react to this, because regarding AI regulations, which is such a huge topic, and I find it sometimes a little bit confusing. I wanted to ask you, maybe you can bring some clarity. What are your thoughts on this? And could you please let us know more about this, if possible?
Yeah, sure. And also, we've done so much research on everything that was just said, so it's so hard to move on from the discussion. We do see a drop in women as they progress the career ladder. We do see a dip around the time that we expect them to be starting families. We did a career break analysis. You can list a career break on your LinkedIn profile, and we saw that men mainly list the reason as, like fun things like, wanting to start a new project or spend more time on something, adjacent to their work, whereas women was carers or starting a family. So we do see that kind of divide in the data as well. On the regulations, I think it's a huge important topic, and not just for gender, but for any kind of disparity. There's a great opportunity to kind of narrow the playing field in the labor market, if it's done intentionally, I think. So I can give a LinkedIn example, perhaps. So one example there would be that, as I said, women tend to not add as many skills, as many STEM skills, as many AI skills, and as many just in general skills on their profile compared to men. And that can kind of hurt your recruiter outreach, right? So that's an issue. But AI can look at things that when women do add to their profiles, like their jobs or their job descriptions, and kind of infer their skill sets from that. And so then, you are kind of leveling the playing field in that respect, because you are increasing the share of skills added by women and added by men, which we call a tech gender gap, for instance, if it's in tech. And that we kind of did a thought experiment on that, and we saw that when AI did infer your skills, it was very close to parity there. So I think AI is not evil, in my opinion. I think the biases, need to be considered as we are biased as we are human. There's going to be bias in models, but I think it's an augmentation tool. I mean, and I would encourage. I sometimes think that people use or talk about the tool and haven't really used it. It's a lifesaver. It saves so much time, and even if you're a coder, you can. I feel like I'm pitching Gen AI. But I think if you're a coder, you can use it to produce some code, with some prompts. But you're so necessary to make sure that the code is accurate and doing what it should do, and it doesn't have bugs. So I think there's like a relationship that develops with the tool. But I think, in general, AI is reshaping economies. And we kind of need, from the company side, proactive leadership to drive gender parity. And in turn, that's going to unlock bigger talent pools, more innovation, kind of more frames of reference from people, more perspectives. And on the policy side, it can only help to increase workforce participation. So, and economic resilience as well. So it's a good thing, I think.
That's a very positive view. I don't know if the panel has reaction. Maybe is there a negative side of AI that for gender equality or in general? Anna says yes.
So I mean, despite coming from an AI research institute, I do think when we talk about regulation, we do need to, I mean, in regulation, I mean, there's policy and there's innovation and skills and education policy that we can, of course, look at in terms of levers to address some of the gender disparity and gaps that we're seeing. On the regulation side, though, and I think it's really important to think a bit about basically the harms, so risks and harms stemming from AI systems, and we unfortunately can see that women are here too disproportionately actually affected. So AI systems disproportionately harm women, we that via biases, but also, for example, gender-based violence, the creation of violence, but also, for example, pornography with generative AI models, and so deep fakes, etc. All of that is a real issue. So I think when countries think about regulation, they need to think specifically around addressing those harms. I mean, of course, preventing them in the first place is always a good idea. And there are lots of really good, of course, policy and regulatory approaches emerging, as is always nicely displayed by the OECD's tracker. But specifically, I would encourage all policymakers to think a bit more about the ex-ante parts of how to address some of these harms, because often these harms happen and they haven't been prevented. And we see those, and they've been well documented, again, by OECD's monitor, for example, incident monitor. So what kind of mechanisms do countries have actually then to not only put the burden of proof on actually victims that have been harmed, but actually thinking a bit about what are better and more effective ways to address them? That can be, for example, a commission that specifically can hear, cases, and because really harms, especially when we talk about psychological harms, so not just physical or economic harms, are really hard to prove and to evaluate. And so it's not easy, but I think having be that actually the courts or having specifically trained commissions, auditors to think a bit about what actually happens once harm has been done by these systems and what to do about it, I think is hopefully a good approach. And that's one of the recommendations coming out of our report as well.
Thank you very much. We are now arriving to almost to the end of the webinar. There has been so many insights, and it's hard to actually wrap up. But obviously, we need more regulations. We need to look more into it. This is going really fast. So for education, it's a huge challenge that we still don't know how to tackle. We need more training. We need training adapted to women too that had less time because of family obligations. Unfortunately, still they are actually falling on women mostly, but getting in there little by little. But I have a last question for all of you, for the four of you. In one, two sentence or very brief, let me know, let us, the audience that is extremely active. I'm sorry, I cannot cope up with your questions and comments, but I'm reading them and they are all very interesting. I would like to know how we can use AI to get more gender equality now and in the future. So whoever wants to begin. Or I pick up one person. Maybe Anna, since I have you in the screen.
So many things have been said, but I mean, I have to say I'm always really hopeful, especially when I'm in a space. I mean, we have our AI for Good lab. Every year we have a demo day. And so that means all the trainees are coming together and presenting their projects and talking a bit about what they learned. And I don't know, this always makes me very hopeful that, you know, the world is moving towards a more equitable and more just actually, you know, approach to this technology and how societies react to it and adapt to it. And that there are so many brilliant women in this space who are really, really keen to make a difference and to create and design technology that is actually inclusive and is useful, and rewards are distributed equally, so equitably. So I don't have a solution, but I'm just saying I'm kind of often hopeful because I'm surrounded by all these brilliant women in AI, and they're making a real difference.
Thank you. So maybe Rosie, now you can
Yeah.
give a 2 sentence.
I think for me, it's identifying where we can use AI for good. So, you know, we also have our own program Data for Impact, which is how we share data with multilaterals and world banks. And I think, you know, it's important to look for ways that it can, you know, augment people's daily lives and daily jobs. So, for example, I gave that LinkedIn example around skills. You know, it can be used for leveling the playing field. So I would highlight that. I also am saying these things in the context of work, you know, so how can it improve your role, and how can we kind of harness AI? But I think, you know, from an industry leader perspective, it opens up bigger talent pools. It opens up, you know, development of women into more leadership roles. It opens up kind of fresh perspectives. And then on the policymaker side, I said, you know, it makes this broader workforce participation possible, but you do need the frameworks, as we've mentioned, for upskilling. And I think, you know, I did a previous panel where a panelist, I think her name was Emily Vestergaard, and she did some research onto why women are less likely to use ChatGPT in their roles compared to men. And I think a big takeaway was that women prefer training, you know, so I think we need to adapt to that preference, and we need to kind of develop these personalized career paths for people.
Yeah, I fully agree, Rosie. So now Stefan, followed by Celine, my 2 colleagues.
Yes, actually, I would like to echo what Rosie just said, you know, that using people's preferences, you know, is a very important one, and that we perhaps actually we have more possibilities to do that. One of the big challenges has been to try to change very quickly people's behavior. And if we think of AI also as a tool that allows to actually identify some of the obstacles with much more granularity and provide feedback much quicker than what we could do before, then I think actually that could be also one of the uses of AI to achieve this equality. But just keep in mind that a lot of these things are not tech-induced, like it's really social things, and that has been actually induced by human beings and not by computers.
True. Yeah, true. And Celine, just your last words to close.
That's great. Adding to what Stefan just said, I'll keep this very short. Echoing, AI is a tool. It is a tool that we create. And so let's remember that, and let's lean in to ensure that it reflects the type of world that we want, the types of societies and economies really that we want to see in the future. So I'll leave it there. Back to you, Marta.
Thank you, Celine. Thank you to all of you. It's been really interesting webinar. I have enjoyed and learned a lot, and I also learned a lot from our audience, who's been extremely active in the chat. I'm gonna save the chat to see and look at all the questions and comments in detail. And I want to end this webinar to thanking my colleague Kevin Gillespie, who organized this webinar, and it's been a great pleasure working with him and all of you. So thank you, and we'll see you in the next webinar from education. Bye.